Hello everybody, my name is Henk de Berg. I'm a professor at the University of Sheffield and the director of the Pockroff Centre. I'm here in Sheffield Cathedral to interview the Oxford theologian Alister McGrath. Alister, welcome to Sheffield Cathedral and the Pockroff Centre.
Thank you, it's very nice to be here.
Alister, in this interview I want to explore your views on the relationship between science and religion, but I want to access that rather complicated topic from a more personal perspective by first of all looking at your own personal development, because you started off as a scientist and I think as a non-believer, and then you became a believer and a theologian as well. How did that development happen?
Well, when I was in high school, I loved science. It was the most wonderful thing there was. And my special love was for chemistry. And I had this view that science and religion were absolutely opposed, that they were at war with each other. And therefore, because I loved science, I just knew I could not be interested in religion at all. And that stayed the way until I won a scholarship to Oxford to study chemistry. And while beginning to study chemistry in detail, I specialized in quantum theory, which was wonderful. I began to re-examine this whole question: what exactly was the problem with religion? And I found that actually I had misunderstood the situation, that it was not as I believed it to be, that actually there were serious and interesting possibilities of interaction and dialogue and enrichment between science and theology. And so, to cut a very long story short, I moved from being an atheist, a rather aggressive atheist is what happened, to being a Christian believer. And as I pursued my science, I did a first degree in chemistry and then a doctorate in molecular biophysics, I began to realize that Christianity was so interesting, I wanted to switch to theology. And having mastered that, to try and understand this relationship between science and faith. And so really that's how I came to be where I am.
Yeah, it's really interesting because that's the kind of the opposite of the development that I think Richard Dawkins went through. Now, I think you're primarily known as a critic of new atheism and of new atheists such as Richard Dawkins, the Oxford evolutionary biologist. Dawkins is of course best known for his book, The God Delusion, and you've written a number of books against Dawkins, including this one, The Dawkins Delusion, and also another book called Dawkins' God. Now, Dawkins' argument, as I understand it, is that he says science is based on observation and experimentation and verification, or at least falsification. So science is really the methodical interrelating of observable, measurable phenomena. So that's why scientists use microscopes to see things that are very small and telescopes to see things that are very far away. But if you use these instruments, you don't see God. You don't see God with a naked eye. You don't see God with a microscope. You don't see God with a telescope. In fact, you don't see God, you don't observe God with any of our senses. So Dawkins says, whilst we can't prove that God does not exist, because you can't prove a negative, why should we postulate the existence of a being like God? Isn't that the same as postulating the existence of a flying spaghetti monster, or to use an example that Bertrand Russell used half a century ago, a celestial teapot? That, I think, in essence, in nutshell, is Dawkins's argument. Now, what's wrong with that argument?
Well, let's begin by looking at the key point. If you're Isaac Newton, you're trying to explain observations. And back in the 17th, early 18th century, he was trying to say, I observe the planets behaving in certain ways, I observe apples falling to the ground. I need an ultimate explanation for this, and I propose gravity, which I cannot detect with any of my senses, but it's proposing a framework that makes sense of what I observe. One point I want to make is that very often in science, we find that we are proposing an explanatory framework to make sense of what we observe, even though we cannot prove that to be right. Nevertheless, we can say it seems to be the best possible explanation of that. So I want to begin by saying that Dawkins actually seems to miss the point. Actually, Christians, for example, believe in God because they say this is the best explanation that can be offered. It's not as if we're proving this is right, but we're saying it certainly makes an awful lot of sense. Now, I think in dealing with Dawkins, there are several points I need to make. One is that I think it's very regrettable that Dawkins actually does not apply the same criteria of judgment to his own beliefs as he does to other people's. I think that's a very important point. I have no doubt we'll talk about that during this discussion. But I think also Dawkins really is a scientific positivist who simply is unaware of the massive difficulties with his own position. As I read Dawkins, I see no evidence whatsoever of any significant knowledge of or engagement with the history and philosophy of science. And when I began to read the history and philosophy of science at the age of 17, I began to realize this scientific positivism does not hold water. And that's extremely important point, because it's saying, in effect, that science is provisional, it's tentative, that actually very often as scientists you believe certain things you cannot prove to be true, but nevertheless you know you have very good reasons for believing them. So what my concern is that Dawkins seems to ignore, for example, the writings of Karl Popper, other writers who I think have a lot to say, like Thomas Kuhn. Mm-hmm. And all of these, I think, give us a much more reliable view of what science is all about. But unfortunately, it's not Dawkins' view, which seems to me simply to be naive and outdated.
So the first thing that's wrong with Dawkins' view is that his view of science is very reductive and is essentially, as you say, a positive kind of positivist view, and that's a view that has been refuted not just by scientists themselves, but also by philosophers. Wittgenstein, you mentioned Thomas Kuhn, other people such as Paul Feyerabend, Imre Lakatos, and so on. So his view of science is reductive. Is his view of religion reductive as well?
I don't think Dawkins really understands what religion is. He never gives us a helpful definition, and the very few attempts he offers at definition are clearly inadequate. Look, one of my professional fields is the study of science and religion, and the first question you have to ask is, how do you define religion scientifically? You can't do it, because religion is actually a cultural phenomenon. I mean, for example, Dawkins seems to assume that religions necessarily believe in God or gods, but actually Buddhism does raise some very significant difficulties there. So there is this, in effect, if you like, a failure to take the scholarship in this field seriously. Dawkins is meant to be a scientist. He's meant to be an intellectual. Why does he not engage the most up-to-date scholarship so that, in effect, when he critiques from a scholarly and informed perspective? He's clearly writing for an audience which knows little about religion and cares even less. And that really concerns me, because I believe truth really matters. And that means you take the other side seriously, even though it causes you intellectual discomfort. I don't see him doing that.
Yeah, for Dawkins, religion seems to be essentially what people in the 19th century and the early 20th century thought that religion was. So philosophers such as Ludwig Feuerbach, who of course famously wrote a book called Das Wesen des Christentums, The Essence of Christianity, published in 1841, or Auguste Comte, who's seen as the father of sociology, positivist sociology, that's also sort of around 1840, but also later thinkers such as Sigmund Freud, who published in 1927 a book called Die Zukunft einer Illusion, the future of an illusion, the illusion being religion, and the future being basically that religion has no future. And all these people seem to share the idea that religion is really a kind of primitive form of science, an early version, or science in its very early stages when it was primitive, undeveloped. So it's a way for them. Religion is a set of propositions, almost sort of scientific, quasi-scientific, chemical, biological propositions about nature, about the universe, and so on, so that, for example, the book of Genesis becomes a really bad biology lesson. That's a very impoverished view of religion, isn't it? I mean, I think one can say that the only people who still hold that view are fundamentalist creationists, and there aren't many of those. So if religion isn't that, what do you think it is?
Well, I think you flatter Dawkins by implying he knows something about Feuerbach or Freud. I mean, he actually, in The God Delusion, quotes from James Frazier's Golden Bough, which is an outdated, discredited view of the anthropology of religion, which modern anthropologists of religion just say that is exactly what we do not think. It's so out of date.
That was 1890.
That was 1890. Why does Dawkins use an outdated, discredited 1890 book to in effect give him his working definition of religion. It's mad. I think there are some very serious questions that need to be raised there. So one of the points I want to make is actually Dawkins really does need to update himself. There's some excellent studies, neutral studies, unbiased studies, which he could engage with, and that would really make for a good conversation, rather than one that's locked into an outdated and discredited past.
So one of the very interesting quotations in your book is one by Terry Eagleton, who says religion was never meant to explain anything in the first place, which I think is perhaps a dubious statement, because I think certainly part of religion was that certainly very early on. But then Eagleton says, the way Dawkins looks at things is a little bit like saying that the electric toaster has made Shakespeare or Chekhov superfluous. Now, on the one hand, you agree with Terry Eagleton, but at the same time, I'm struck by reading your work, how for you, it seems to me, religion is still largely an epistemological phenomenon. It's a way of, I think, let me quote you here if I can find it. You say, religion for you is a way to make sense of the world by giving you a way of seeing reality which affirms both reality's intelligibility and its coherence. So in that sense, religion is still has a largely cognitive function. So I wonder what you make of Christian concepts such as forgiveness or divine grace, or when other people say, well, what religion gives me is consolation or inner strength.
I think many people would say that the great strength, or indeed the great appeal of religion, is the fact that it offers consolation, or in effect it empowers you, or makes you feel special and wanted. These are very important themes. But for me, the whole idea of religion, particularly Christianity, is about that and more than that. In other words, yes, it is about these things, but it's also about a new way of seeing our world. It is in fact about discerning meaning and value. And I think it's extremely important, because that is something that science does not do. That in effect we're talking about questions which are teleological, like why are we here? Or deeply existential, like what is my personal meaning? And psychologists bring home to us how integral these questions are to human nature. You cannot be a human being without thinking these deep questions. What is the point of life? Why am I here? And any philosophy that refuses to engage those questions is simply failing to take human existence seriously. Christianity does engage those questions. Others, yes, you're quite right, but it also says we need to talk about value and meaning, and those are given to us in the Christian faith. So science, for me, is very, very good at helping us to understand how this universe functions. But the deeper question of, does it matter, and what is the point of it? Those are separate questions. And in many ways, we need to bring these together in a sort of enriched view of things if we're going to have a big view of the universe, which actually enables us to live meaningfully.
Could you explain that a bit more? Because, again, the statement that I read to you, the focus there seems to be on intelligibility and coherence, where what you've just said just now is more about meaning, which seems to me sort of a slight shift. Why am I misunderstanding
let's
something?
Come back to the whole question of intelligibility, because I think that is a very important point. Because one of the themes in the New Testament, it's there in some of the Pauline letters, but it's not accentuated, but it's there. And it is that, in effect, the Christian faith gives us a lens, a way of looking at the world, which enables us to discern a coherent reality, to make sense of it. In other words, that Christianity is giving you a lens which brings this into focus and allows you to see interconnections. If you like, it's giving you a panoramic vision of reality, so that individual aspects of it suddenly come into focus and cohere. And to me, that really is important, that idea of intelligibility. Now, the big question I want to ask is this: why can we make so much sense of the world? I mean, think of Albert Einstein, his very famous remark that the great mystery of the universe is its intelligibility. Why can we make sense of it? And of course, one of the reasons that Christians would give is that, in effect, we bear the image of God, and that means that there is this innate desire to understand our world and ourselves as God's creation, but at the same time, not simply a desire to do so, but some sort of ability, because in some ways, there's a resonance between us us and the mind of God. So there's some very interesting lines of exploration we could follow through there.
I'm still struggling. I think I still struggle to understand that. So what is the greater clarity that religion or faith gives us when looking at the world? That then is not a sort of a scientific explanation, but is also not reducing meaning down to what each individual makes of it.
I think that what religion is doing really is giving us new perspectives on reality, or indeed allowing us to answer questions at a deeper level than might otherwise be the case. In other words, everyone is looking at the same reality, but nevertheless we see it in different ways. And the point I'm trying to make is, if you like, we can have a scientific perspective on the world, and that's very important. How does it work? But there's more than one perspective, and we don't have to say it's this and not that, because they can combine to give us a richer understanding of things. And so one of the things I'm saying is that Christianity, for me, gives us, if you like, this framework for beginning to look at our world and seeing it in a new way. Now, we just talked a moment ago about Thomas Kuhn. Let's come back to him, because as a philosopher and historian of science, he's very interesting. And he makes the point that actually a theory informs the way in which you see things. So he says, look, before Copernicus, we looked at the Earth and we saw it as being the center of the universe. After Copernicus, we look at it and we see it as a planet orbiting a distant star. In other words, we're looking at the same thing, we see it in different ways. And that actually is a very good way of thinking about the difference that religion makes. You're looking at the same world, but you're seeing it in a different way. Not nature, but God's creation. Looking at human beings, not a statistical number in the human population, but rather somebody who is special and is beloved of God. So this is in effect a way of adding depth to a purely scientific way of thinking. It is not negating a scientific way of thinking. It is not denying that. It's saying that's great, but it is only part of a bigger picture. And we need to make sure that bigger picture, that fuller story, is told, and not, as Richard Dawkins would like us to do, to say there is science, we draw the line, that is it. No, there is science. Wonderful. There's more that needs to be said.
Where does that leave more traditional Christian notions, such as let's just take one, eternal life, the promise of eternal life in the hereafter? That seems to be directly at odds with science. So what does that mean for eternal life? Does it then become more of a metaphor?
I think the idea of eternal life is very, very a rich idea. And I take the point you're making, because if we'd been having this conversation, say, 100 years ago, I mean, the idea of eternal life might have been puzzling. But of course, since then, cosmology has changed radically. And perhaps we now might say that actually now we know our universe had a beginning, that eternity is not about an infinite expansion of time, but is rather being outside space-time. In other words, it's referring to something that actually is outside the normal processes of our universe. So we can see immediately that opens up some very important ways of thinking. For me, one of the key things about the idea of eternal life is about beginning something which nothing is going to take away from us. And obviously it does need unpacking, as you rightly say, but it's this very powerful sense that life as we know it is good, but actually it is in effect the beginning of something still better. And therefore it's to be valued, but at the same time it's to be set in a proper perspective, because there is something that is better that lies in the future.
So is it then the belief in eternal life something along the, and I realize that obviously, you know, it very much depends also what individuals believe, because I think you say in your books one of the great things about religion is also that it sort of leaves people that space, and that it's not just one dogmatic thing or sort of a set of dogmas as Dawkins seems to believe. But one way of looking at the eternal life would be then say that we're all part of this larger meaningful whole, and that when we disappear, we will have contributed to that whole, so that we kind of live on in that way rather than in the simplistic way that at some point we'll all rise from the grave, and you know, which isn't even in the Bible anyway, by the way.
I think that for me, the important thing is that I speak as an individual. I'm just saying, here's the way I would make sense of these ideas. I think what you'll find is that individual Christians will understand these ideas in slightly different ways. Yes. And so I don't want to impose my views on anyone else. I think that's a very important point to make. But I must also make the point that actually it is very, very easy to criticize, for example, Christianity or Islam or Judaism by fixing on individual Christians or Jews or Muslims who you dislike, and in effect saying they represent this totality, therefore by ridiculing them, I ridicule them all. I think Dawkins is unaware of the complexity and richness, and he very often seems to draw on American fundamentalist Christians as if these were somehow representative of Christianity as a whole. We just say very clearly.
Sorry for interrupting, you give a wonderful example of that in one of your books, where you quote the scientist Freeman Dyson, who says, who talks about sort of his version of belief, and then says, well, to be honest, I don't have a lot of time for the Trinity. And then Dawkins immediately says, that means that you're not really a Christian, which is a completely unempirical statement, of course, on that.
It's a non-empirical statement, and the point is that Dyson is saying, I haven't really figured this one out. It doesn't matter to me. But of course, one of the things I'd want to say immediately is that for Christians, you are on a journey of discovery, a journey of faith, by which things that sometimes do not seem to make sense come to make sense as you engage them. And that's true of science as well. Very often, in quantum theory, you're confronted with ideas that are deeply counterintuitive, and you have to wrestle with them to understand what they mean. And you could just say, well, I'm not going to bother with that. It doesn't make sense to me. But the whole point is we are called to engage these things that seem difficult and figure out what they mean.
Talk to me a little bit about the notion of original sin, because you write that that's one of the Christian concepts that you've come to appreciate more and more over the years.
I think that's right. And actually, I think a point is where Dawkins and I may converge. Because for me, the whole idea of original sin is saying that actually, while human beings are in many ways very admirable, in other ways they are not. There's some kind of tension within us. We may in effect recognize good things, but we end up doing something considerably different than that. I think that's an extremely important point because it's very realistic. It's saying that actually we have a remarkable capacity to mess things up. And that means that it's a very powerful antidote to a kind of utopian idealism, which says we are wonderful. Do you remember, you may remember this, the day the first man stepped on the moon? I can remember that, watching it live on BBC. And I remember thinking then, as an atheist, this is all about humanity being able to conquer the universe and make it a better place. The next morning, I just rethought that. Yes, we've stepped on the moon, but the Vietnam War is going on. There's poverty everywhere. There's race riots everywhere. We may have stepped on the moon, but we really have some problems. I think it's really saying we need to be honest about human nature and face up to the fact we mess things up in a very big way.
I wonder if that isn't actually a point where you and Dawkins, I keep wanting to say Darwin, but I think that's too much credit for Dawkins. You would probably even agree with that. But one of the points where you actually diverge, because it seems to me that if you take a Dawkinsian approach to science and people, where people are essentially rational beings and they should be able certainly to outgrow all this religious nonsense and all the rest of it. If you have that rational or rationalistic view of man, is much harder, I think, to explain the mess that's going on in the world than if you take a religious point of view, which emphasizes man's finitude and fallibility.
I think that is right, but Dawkins at several points, especially in his book The Selfish Gene, makes the point that there's almost some sort of genetic predisposition to do things that are selfish. And actually, that really is something where a Christian theologian would say, right, I agree with you, let's talk about that more. Now, interestingly, despite spending most of The Selfish Gene talking about the human propensity towards selfishness and its grounding in our genetic inheritance, Dawkins at the end says very grandly that we can rise above this. We can, in effect, resist our genetic inheritance. Well, I'm sorry, we can't really. And what I want to know is how on earth he reconciles that final statement with what came earlier in the book. If you're a Christian, basically it'd be lovely to say, I wish I could do this, I'm going to do all I can, but it's necessary to say, but there are going to be limits to this, and I need to recognize my limitations. And that to me is so important. Recognizing our limitations is one of the first steps in avoiding the kind of situations which lead us to do certain things which are very unwise.
Yeah. It seems to me that that is precisely, as you're saying, the kind of thing that Dawkins does not want to do. If you look at the final sentences of the God Delusion, it's something along the lines of, I'm thrilled to live in an age where humanity is pushing against the limits of understanding. Even better, we might find that there are no limits to human understanding at all. That's a very strange thing to say, although it's actually very similar to what Freud says at the end of The Future of an Illusion, where Freud says, we can't get anywhere else what we can't get from science. Now, you say, I think very rightly, that science in many ways is limited. I'm sure you're familiar with this image where you say, well, if this is what we know, this little circle, then the bit around it, what we know is that we don't know is a little bit bigger. But the moment we know more, then the stuff we don't know grows with that as well. And of course, also, and you quote Einstein on this, science may tell us what is the case, to some extent anyway, but it cannot tell us what ought to be the case, what we ought to do. But I wonder, and whether you would agree that one of the great things about religion, apart from the many drawbacks it can have, but one of the great things about religion is precisely that it can warn us against that kind of superbia, to use the medieval term, that kind of hubris, that kind of intellectual pride. Because isn't one of the things that religion tells us precisely that man can never be God? So that there is implicit in religion this kind of warning, to use a mythological image, don't fly too closely to the sun. Be aware of your own limitations.
I think that is very important. And my concern would be that Dawkins, in effect, has this rather charming but very naive view of what human beings actually do, and above all, what human beings do with science. Why did we invent atom bombs? Was that to make the world a better place? No, it was to eliminate a rival nation. And why did a scientist invent napalm? Was it to, as he suggests, to actually control certain weeds? It wasn't. It was to wipe out troop formations, and it was to wipe out city populations, as in the firebombing of Tokyo in 1945. So we've got to face up to this fundamental problem that actually science, in my view, is very exciting, but morally it's neutral. In fact, morally it's even blind. The problem is you can take some science and do some very good things with it, or you can do some disastrous things, turning it into an agent of mass destruction. We are the ones who do this. And so I read the end of Dawkins' God Delusion, I think, good God, this man's deluded. This is not a realistic account of human nature. We need to face up to the problems about human nature and see what can be done about that.
And religion can help us with that, is what you're saying.
Religion can help us. I mean, religion can go wrong. Let's make it absolutely clear. I mean, the enemy of religion is bad religion, which actually takes us into some very dark places. And science can go into those dark places as well. But religion, in effect, gives us a way of understanding ourselves, which makes us realize how we are prone to delusions about our own intellectual abilities and our own moral capacities, and says, look, face up to yourself, look at yourself in the mirror and ask, am I really quite so clear about this as I thought I was? It's a challenge to look at ourselves, face up to who we are, and then temper some of these decisions in the light of that insight.
Because that's the other thing that religion does, isn't it? Religion instills doubt in us, almost a kind of Cartesian doubt, sort of a systematic doubt, that you keep questioning things and that you're constantly uncertain and insecure about things, including things that religion and Christianity can't solve, such as how do you square, God's goodness with the existence of evil. And therefore I've always found it strange that Dawkins has this view of believers as this incredibly dogmatic, cocksure people who know exactly how things are, whereas in reality, if you look at believers and theologians, they're probably much more skeptical than Dawkins is.
Dawkins once said that he never read works of theology, and he saw that as a mark of pride on his part. He ought to talk to more religious believers respectfully and listen to them. He ought to read more works of theology, then he would actually know what he's talking about. I think that is really serious, because I, as an atheist turned Christian theologian, make a point of reading atheist works to make sure I understand where people are and take them with the utmost seriousness. There is no intellectual virtue whatsoever in misrepresentation, in refusing to listen to people, refusing to take them seriously. If you're going to have a serious conversation, you listen to them. In philosophy, there's this wonderful debate about epistemic virtue. And the key point is it's a level playing field. You treat others as you would treat them. And I think the point is that Dawkins does not really seem to be able to empathize, to take seriously any views other than his own. And the result is he simply ridicules where listening is important. Even if you don't agree, you listen, you understand, respect, and then say, I'm sorry, I think you're wrong for these reasons. He doesn't listen.
Do you have the final question? Do you have the feeling that you've made? I'm kind of assuming the answer is no, but do you feel that you've made any headway with Dawkins, because you're a scientist, you've got a doctorate in molecular biophysics, that he then say, oh gosh, there is this guy, who's really intelligent, who knows his science. Maybe I've got to rethink some of the assumption that Dawkins, have about religion. Has that happened? Is there any sign of that?
I would say I've made no impact whatsoever on him. I'm a religious person, therefore I am mentally deficient in his view, and I'm a traitor because I used to be a scientist, I switched sides in his view. I think I just leave it to your viewers to decide whether that is actually a good thing or a bad thing. But the point I'm going to make is that Dawkins, in effect, is now seen as someone who is so locked into his own dogmatic atheism, he's incapable of listening to people, let alone responding to what they say. He responds to what he thinks they say, and that's predetermined by his atheism. It's not happening. It's a dialogue of the deaf.
Alister, thank you for doing this interview.
A pleasure.